Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what is the third day of Engage 2020. It's great to have you here with us. And I'm Paul Manners. I'm co-director of the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement. First of all, I'd like to introduce Vidhya. And Vidhya is the Chief Executive and the founding director of Power to Change, which is an independent trust that was set up in 2015 to support the growth of community businesses across England and to create more prosperous and cohesive communities. So Vidhya has got lots and lots of experience working in policy with think tanks in government in the UK and in the US. And before setting up Power to Change, Vidhya was Deputy Chief Executive at the Resolution Foundation, a leading public policy think tank working on issues affecting low and middle income families. Richard is chair in material physics and innovation policy at the University of Manchester, and before that was a pro vice chancellor for research and innovation at Sheffield University, and that's where I first met Richard. He was principal investigator on the university's RC UK funded Catalyst for Public Engagement programme. He was also a member of RC UK's Public Engagement Advisory Group, so his experience in this field I think goes back a long way. So welcome to Richard. And welcome to Vidhya. I think Richard's sort of recent analysis of the unequal regional distribution of research and innovation funding has been really quite catalytic. And I think somebody loved it in government called Dominic Cummings, who championed Richard's work, which I think he's still coming to terms with. So our focus today is on place. And I think place clearly has had a sort of huge amount of attention recently. It's become, I think, really a real focus for higher education policy. And this is just an example of some of the activity really anchoring in place, university in its place. The report on the right is a report Richard did for Nesta, which looked at that unequal distribution. The Civic University Network that the NCCP is part of has 100 universities who are all committed to a sort of stronger regional and local focus to their work. Outside HE, I think place has been an absolutely live and important focal point for all kinds of projects. Sort of top left here is a really, really interesting publication that Vidhya authored for Power to Change about local community spirit in COVID-19. Lots of other work looking at how we can get better joined up, more integrated policies, more collaboration, and a real sort of focus on involving communities in shaping whatever kinds of solutions are developed. Those of you who were here yesterday will have heard Ottoline Laser, who's the Chief Executive of UKRI, this beautiful quote that somebody is putting some fantastic quotes onto our notice board. But Ottoline talked about not only trying to embed working with communities into research, but also embedding research and innovation into the community. But a place focus is something that's really important to UKRI. Those of you who follow government policy may have tried to digest the UK R&D roadmap earlier this year. And that puts as a major priority taking account of place-based outcomes in how we make decisions about R&D. And that's very much, I think, what we'll be talking about today is how to start to put a place focus on where the money goes. And a real ambition from the government to see research and innovation funding going up, but also going to new and different places to achieve really positive public and social good. Finally, just a reminder of this quote, which Sophie and I used in the opening plenary on Monday from Julia Unwin, who was our keynote last year. I love this quote. She talks about universities and people who work in universities are used to being the cleverest person in the room. But when you work in place, you are never the cleverest person in the room because by definition, you know less. But to go in with humility, offering the assets you have, the extraordinary analytic power and the buildings you have seems to me to be an offer that has never been more needed or more urgent. And I think that opportunity is what we're going to explore today as to how can universities really contribute to place. And Vidhya, I'm so delighted that you've joined us. Thank you. I'd love to hand over to you now, and I think you're going to challenge us, but also be very positive about how you think universities can play their part.
So as Paul's already said, this session is about place, and I particularly want to give a community perspective on place and reflect a bit on the challenges communities have faced during COVID-19, and also talk about, in the second half of the presentation, the real opportunities that there are for higher education institutions to partner with communities, and what that can look like, and what the principles need to be that underpin that. But just to kick off, I wanted to start with this slide, which is from a fantastic project run by the think tank Onward that we are supporting at Power to Change. And it looks at the social fabric across the country. And this is a concept which goes beyond more well-established academic concepts such as social capital, but tries to look at the range of dimensions that are needed to create resilient and strong places. So it covers these 5 pillars. It includes things like levels of volunteering, other kinds of civic infrastructure, places in communities where people can meet, as well as things like quality of jobs and quality of housing and a range of other things. And what you can see very clearly is that there is quite varied and unequal social fabric across the country. So the purple areas are where the social fabric is strongest, and the green where it's most frayed. Those of you who know the sort of regional inequality maps of the UK will recognise that this very much reflects, although it's not identical to a map of deprivation, there is a strong correlation between these maps of social fabric and maps of say, the indices of multiple deprivation. And so I think the starting point that we need to kind of understand is that there is huge inequality in the community fabric, the community strength across the country. And areas that have struggled for many years, for example, coastal communities in the north, former industrial communities, are areas where the social fabric is far weaker than in larger cities, in areas in the south of England, for example. So that's the starting point. Just to pause for a moment on kind of community business, which is where Power to Change plays in this kind of wider community space. So we were set up, as Paul said, in 2015 to really push momentum behind the growth and development of community-led businesses across England. And one of the things that I think is particularly exciting about community businesses is that they tend to thrive in particularly disadvantaged communities where other approaches often fail. So they are often strong in areas where the private sector struggles, and they are often a more successful approach to working in place than some of the more top-down government-led initiatives have been in the past. So we estimate currently that there are about 9,000 community businesses in England. They cover a whole range of sectors, so everything from community-led housing and community energy to community transport, shops, pubs, but about a third of them are some kind of hub, be that a village hall or an urban community hub. So a multi-purpose setting offering a whole range of services and supports to its local community. Most community businesses have a substantial part of their income that's derived from trading, and you can then see how COVID has had a significant impact on them, which I will go on to talk about. On average, about 62% of their income is derived from trading, but some will be fully trading. There's quite diversity within the sector. Their top impact area is health and well-being, but they have substantial impacts on community cohesion, reducing isolation, local economic development, those sorts of areas. And as I said, one of the things that we find most exciting about them is the fact that they are able to survive in areas that are face particular challenges. So 2/3 of our funding has gone into the bottom third of indices of multiple deprivation. So what has the experience been over the course of the pandemic? So we did some research, particularly in the summer, talking to community businesses and other kinds of community organisations, really trying to capture what the experiences were and what people were facing in terms of challenges. I think there are two things to say. So one is that there was no single or uniform experience. There was a huge amount of diversity, and that was partly derived from what we saw in the previous map, which is the starting point for the community in terms of its overall community strength and social fabric, determined a lot about the extent to which it was able to mobilise quickly and activate in order to respond to the crisis. So where social fabric was strong, communities were in a much better place and often in a much better relationship with their local authority to be able to respond rapidly. But the pattern overall has really been threefold. So the first is around crisis. So as I said, most community businesses and many kind of charitable organisations in general now derive a large amount of their income from trading. So for many of them, it was a huge financial crisis as trading income stopped. Many of them had to close substantial parts of their operations. So there was a real stress and challenge on how to keep going, how to make use of emergency schemes in order to keep going. So our emergency response in the summer, so we funded a £12 million COVID-19 response, of which a large proportion was targeted on filling the gap in trading income that organisations were facing. The next element of the impact of COVID was really around adaptation. And I think this was where we were most impressed and sort of startled really by the response that came from community businesses and other community organisations. And that was really the huge amount of adaptation that we saw. And we saw this across the economy, but it was pretty striking how quickly community businesses were able to adapt, really driven by their social purpose and their desire to support their communities. They shifted things online. They started food delivery services. As soon as they closed their doors, they started to think about other ways in which they could meet the needs of their communities. So in contrast to other businesses, many of them didn't furlough all of their staff. They tried to keep some staff on in order to continue to meet the needs of local people. And there was a huge amount of innovation and adaptation, some of which will continue into the long term. I think people have found ways in which things that they experimented with in COVID, they will make part of their business models going forward. And then we're sort of moving now into the third phase of the response, which is really around resilience and how these organizations build long-term resilience. Many of them have got business models that now need serious thinking. They're no longer entirely fit for purpose. They may have been deriving lots of income from renting out space. What's the likelihood that that is going to be as viable going forward as it was, as people rethink offices, etc.? So a lot of our support now is focused on much longer term thinking. So we're tending to focus on annual, grants that last for at least a year, give people space and time to think about how do they build resilience for them as organizations and for the places where those organizations are based as we move into a post-COVID world. And with this morning's news on the vaccine, it does feel like that is now a possibility. And I just wanted to sort of end this section before I go on to talk about how higher education institutions can work with communities, really just sort of focusing on the community response to COVID. And one of the things that was really exciting about what we saw during the crisis was this real upsurge in community spirit. And as Paul referenced already, we produced a report in May trying to capture and understand some of what was going on in that response. And I think what we saw was community as the first line of defence. Most of us, thankfully, have not had to rely on the NHS or social care to get us through this crisis. We have relied on our community fabric, our neighbours, our friends, our family. That has been the thing that sustained us and got us through. And I think the challenge here is that whilst there's been a lot of excitement about this upsurge in community spirit, we know from what we were seeing on the ground that sustaining that is dependent on the infrastructure of existing community organisations remaining strong. So what we were seeing a lot of is smaller mutual aid groups, these very local neighbourhood, informal almost groups, being supported by more established community organisations. So whilst we've been really celebrating that very informal mutual aid network that's grown up through the crisis, I think the reality is that these organisations all exist in an ecosystem, and the strength of any of them is dependent on the strength of all of them. So as we look forward, we need to think not just about how we sustain what we saw as being new and exciting through the crisis, but we sustain the whole ecosystem that supports community-led activity within place. So going on to think about sort of the relationship between higher education institutions and communities, I think there are three key areas and three key ways in which higher education institutions can really support and strengthen community activity and community organisations, community businesses. So the first is really, and this will be well known to many of you, I'm sure, is higher education institutions to really take on and embrace your role as anchor organisations within place. So you have a large footprint within place, you are powerful organisations within place, and really thinking about how you use that footprint and use that presence in place to support the ecosystem of organisations around you. So whether that's through your employment practices, through your supply chains, through other ways in which you can support local organisations, opening up space in your buildings for community organisations, using your land, for other community activities, surplus land, could that be a community garden? Are there things that you can do to empower the ecosystem of the place where you're based, and really use that financial and sort of institutional power that you have within a place to do more to support the ecosystem around you? The second is really at the heart of what you do. It's supporting community organisations, community businesses through research. And these two pictures won't make much sense to you, but this is some work that we did with the Heseltine Institute at the University of Liverpool. So we worked with them a couple of years ago now to map the community business marketplace in the Liverpool City region. That gave us enormous leverage with the combined authority in the city region, and has led to the creation of a new social investment vehicle, into which we're investing £1 million, and the combined authority is investing 5.5 million. So it's the beginnings of a long-term social investment vehicle for the city region to support the social economy, which will include community businesses and other kinds of locally rooted trading organisations that drive purpose in the city region. And that investment vehicle that we are now in the process of setting up, that will start its first pilot phase in January, we only really got there because of the research that was done in partnership with the Heseltine Institute and the University of Liverpool. So the extent to which you can enable through research the case to be made for community-led activity is incredibly powerful. And there are real opportunities for you to bring your innate skills in research and all of that experience that you have, and marry it with the mission and the agenda of community organisations to be able to convince other stakeholders, be they government or business or others, to take this agenda forward, invest in it and drive it forward. So I think that is an incredibly powerful way of partnering, and one we've seen work really, really effectively. And then finally, the third area is building longer term partnerships, really strong, long lasting partnerships where, rather than just being project based, they're more on an ongoing basis. So this is a picture of New Wortley, which is a community business in Leeds, on the New Wortley estate in Leeds. They worked very closely over a long period of time with Leeds Beckett University, seconding architecture students and other academics to help shape the development of a new community hub that they got funded and then wanted to design. So they're already a well-established organisation, but they really took the partnership with the university on to be able to build the best new community facility that they could. We've also worked with AHRC in the past to put together the Community University Partnership Initiative, which was run by NCCPE, to really enable as part of that programme, long-standing kind of in-depth partnerships to develop between community businesses and universities. So really trying to identify a shared agenda on which that partnership could work over a year or so. And just to wrap up, I just wanted to really end with this, which is really around the principles of working with communities. And I hadn't seen that quote from Julia before, but it's really, a lot of this speaks to that. It's, when working with communities, we've got to take an approach which recognises where that you as academics bring your expertise, but the community as people with lived experience bring their own expertise, and it's that meeting as equal partners that is the sort of the kernel of a strong partnership. So some of the things that we have identified in long-standing work on this agenda that really drive a positive way of engaging with communities is, engage early at the formative stages of projects, work with existing community organisations, try to understand and map who actually is in the place where you're based, understand what the assets are of the place that you're based, and work with those organisations to start to build that long-term engagement. Try to address the barriers to access and participation, so that so you're drawing in some of the less heard voices, some of the community organisations that are the less obvious suspects, and build the capacity of the community as part of how you go about this. So I think one of the things, going back to the very first slide in that map, is that working in communities means starting where that community is and recognising that map of differential capacity across the country. And so as part of engaging in partnership, there is also a need through that partnership to build the capacity of that community, particularly those communities that are further behind in terms of their social fabric and their community capacity. But I think there are real opportunities here, and it would be really great to see fantastic initiatives like the Civic Universities Network built on over the next couple of years to lead to some great partnerships. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vidhya. That was great. I'm going to hand over really straight away to Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and it's a real pleasure to be talking to you. As Paul said, this is a community I know well. I've been to this conference before. I quick look through the participants. There's some old friends there, I see. So it's great to be here, and particularly at this moment where this idea of place and this kind of political slogan of levelling up really has got some real traction. And I'm going to start video has showed you a striking map of disparities in social fabric. I'm going to show you some other maps that all pretty much say the same thing. Here's a map of the economic performance of the UK in comparison with the rest of Europe, and I think this just really strikes home the idea that the UK is a divided country by all measures. It's an outlier amongst developed countries, in that. In the greater southeast, we've got something that looks pretty much like a prosperous Northern European country, the same kind of levels of productivity as you see in Benelux and southern Germany. But if you look at the rest of the country, what you've got is something that's actually looking in productivity terms generally worse than East Germany, more like southern Italy, Spain and Portugal. And of course this translates into living standards. Here's a plot from Vidhya's old colleagues in the Resolution Foundation, slightly finer scale. Productivity directly translates into living standards. Actually, slightly less so actually, because the UK is a transfer union. In a sense, the UK generates money in the prosperous parts of the country and transfers it to the rest of the country partially, but not enough to overcome those disparities. If I blow up the UK, again you see the same pattern, very much the same pattern as the plot of social fabric that Vidhya showed earlier. This shows up in skills. If you look at the levels of skills and education, just England and Wales this time, but again you see this matching pattern. Actually, the skills plot's really rather interesting. I think there's a kind of interesting question of causality here. Many policymakers will say, oh yes, well the problem with South Yorkshire, say, is that skills are very weak, and that's kind of true. But it's it's not obvious to me that the obvious solution that they come to is, well, we just need to spend more time on skills. I'm not sure. I think there's a demand side problem to this. You have weak economies; they don't demand skills. People don't feel that there's any benefit in getting those skills. So on all these measures, we have this very unequal country. And I should say there's some simple narratives here that I'm going to mention, which I think are not in fact true. I mean, to start with, there's a kind of simple narrative, the north versus the south. That's clearly not the case. Wales is the poorest part of Great Britain. Northern Ireland's also very, very, very poor too. Then you've got the idea that this is all about, there's a big political narrative now about, it's towns versus cities. Places like Manchester are booming and their surroundings aren't. Again, this isn't true. The economics of it tells us cities should be the drivers of productivity, and our core cities are not doing very well. If we compare the UK to Germany, the big striking difference is the number of second-tier cities in Germany that are very productive, very prosperous, very successful communities. We're unusual in having this unipolar state where only London is the successful city. In fact, I believe it's actually Bristol is the only core city that is above the UK average in terms of its economic productivity. So it's not about towns versus cities, and there's a real granularity to it. So there's a kind of granularity of disadvantage. We've got those underperforming core cities that should be doing better than they are, but we've got formally industrialised regions that have never recovered from deindustrialisation. You've got, Barnsley, Rochdale, Dudley, South Wales valleys, and it's the South isn't immune from this. You go to the Medway towns, they have a similar character, and then you have rural and coastal peripheries, places like Lincolnshire or Pembrokeshire or Cornwall or southern Scotland, where you have a different set of problems. So I think I think we should keep on stressing the problem that we face in this very divided country, but it's a divided country in a way that has a number of different dimensions. So what's research got to do with this? What have universities got to do with it? Well, I think to start with universities, obviously this has been a really tough time for universities. Both, we've got a financial crisis that's resulted from COVID, but enormous stresses on our staff. And I think it's really important to recognise what a tough time everyone is having at the moment. And universities are unpopular in government, and I think they're not understood, and that's a great pity. Nonetheless, I think universities are very powerful institutions with a very strong sense of public value, and they have a really important part to play. And I think one of the most interesting themes has been this idea of the civic university, the idea that the university isn't, particularly even, research universities, which I think in former times occasionally took the view that, a big research university is an international institution that by some terrible accident of history, the University of Manchester happened to be situated in this scruffy northern city. I think we've moved well beyond that. I think John Goddard, I'm going to mention as somebody who wrote some very early and important work on this. We've seen the civic university. So I think this has been a really excellent trend. I think it's been really good. But in a way, it's a little bit back to the future. My old institution, Sheffield, was a red brick university, and we used to be very fond of this fundraising leaflet that illustrated, why Sheffield needed a university. It should be for the people. Bring the highest education within the reach of children, of working men, help local industries. Actually, this, it's pretty much a manifesto, apart from a slightly gendered language. It's a totally modern manifesto for a civic university. So I think this new view is the same as the old view in that sense. Universities, it's a return to their roots, if you like, that universities really are anchors of their local communities and their local economies. So that's the situation in universities. On the research side of things, Paul mentioned this new environment that we're seeing. There was the R&D roadmap was published in the summer, and I think it reflected a real enthusiasm for research in government. Actually, in some ways, I occasionally worry, particularly, yes, Paul has alluded to my unexpected celebrity endorsement from Dominic Cummings. I think that, I think I do worry a little bit that there's a certain amount of uncritical enthusiasm, particularly for the kind of high technology side of research as a saviour of the UK. But nonetheless, this is enthusiasm that's translated in substantial funding. We saw in the spending review, a very, very tough spending review, but actually research did really well with a really substantial uplift in funding and a 3-year settlement, despite those very huge pressures on public spending. So I think there are really high hopes for what research can do, and for the first time, this emphasis on place. And so the Research and Development Roadmap had some entirely new language, which we've not seen in science policy before at all, about the role of R&D in levelling up, in changing these, in alleviating these economic disparities across the country. And we've got an R&D Place Advisory Group, and that's chaired by the Minister. I sit on it, in fact, and there's kind of quite interesting proposals being developed, and we're expecting to see this R&D Place strategy in the new year. And then we're seeing new structures in the research world. We've got UKRI coming along as a new organisation. We've got a new CEO, and Paul's already you've heard from Ottoline with some interesting and new ideas about a particular emphasis on making research more inclusive. And I think this comes from the top two. If we look at what Amanda Soloway has been saying, here a couple of quotes from a speech that Amanda made on the 7th of October about scientists need to better understand the range of challenges and opportunities across the entire country and the lives led by a diverse range of people. So deepening the interaction between science and society, inspiring people about science and engaging them, mutual trust between those doing research and those affected by it. So this is an environment that I think is really very, very positive, despite the difficulties that the pandemic is exposing us to and the very real problems that the country has. I think that there's some very good rhetoric going along. Of course, translating rhetoric into action is always difficult. Now, I want to talk about three big trends in science policy that bear on our work in public engagement. I want to talk a bit more about levelling up. I also want to talk about healthcare and how we should rethink healthcare in the wake of the pandemic. And also, I want to talk about what I think is the really massive challenge that face all of us. That's climate change and net zero. So on levelling up, Paul's also already kindly mentioned the report I did, and I'm very proud to have been introduced at a recent meeting by David Willits as the enfant terrible of the levelling up debate. And this plot, I think, is a plot that Tom Forth and I published in our report, which I think really is really striking and really quite shocking. This plot shows how much money is spent on R&D across the UK in nuts 2 regions apart from London, both in business and in the public sector. And what's really striking about it, a number of things are striking about it. The first thing is that actually the public sector funding is even more concentrated than the private sector funding. So in a sense, our government R&D policy up to now has been an anti-levelling up policy. It's even been more, focused even more than the private sector has. But the kind of headline is that if you take London and 2 sub-regions, the one that's got Oxford in and the one that's got Cambridge in, that's 46% of the spending, and there's only 21% of the population. So I think this is really, really striking. We've got essentially, as I say, the UK is a transfer union. We do transfer money from the places that are more prosperous to the places that are less prosperous, but we don't do that for those kinds of investments that are the ones that are kind of likely to do most to boost productivity and performance in those places. So Oxford and Cambridge are great. I think it's fantastic that the UK has places like that. They're great knowledge-based economies, and it's great that we have them, but we need to have some more of them. I kind of talk about this is money, and it's easy to talk about money, but of course money follows people. And I think it's really difficult to talk about an inclusive research system if there's so many places in the country where people just don't come across people who are involved in research. And so if you look at the people side of this equation, if you walk out of St Pancras and into West London, 5.4% of all employed people in inner West London are researchers. It's, you know, absolutely in the fabric of the place. In East Anglia, in Bucks Park and Oxfordshire, it's about 2%. So, you know, these are people you'll meet at the school gate. These are the people you meet down the pub. If you go down to big cities, it drops to about 1%, 0.8% in Manchester. But by the time you're in these places like southern Scotland or Cornwall or Lincolnshire or Shropshire, it's fractions of a percent. So how can you convince people in communities that where, you know, research is just not a thing, they don't meet people who do this, how can you convince them it's got any relevance to their lives? And of course, public engagement, you know, one of the great movements in public engagement, which I think has been really positive, has been that we've tried to mainstream it into, oh, sorry, that's a terrible term, but we've tried to make it so that researchers in universities think that it's part of their role to do this. And so, in a sense, we've tried to correctly integrate public engagement into the research base itself. But of course, the danger of this is that it then focuses on places where the researchers are rather than where they aren't. And those places are, of course, the places where research is already most woven into the fabric of society. So I think we have got, you know, there are excellent initiatives starting to take research to places where researchers are rarer, and we do need to support those more. And we also, I think, need to support, you know, the rest of the country ought to become more research intensive too. Okay, if I want to move on to healthcare, so this is my last map. And in some ways, the most shocking of all these maps, this relationship between prosperity, living standards, social fabric, where it really hits the rubber is in poor health outcomes. Literally, it costs you years of life to live in, you know, living in the South Wales valleys compared to living in Cambridge costs you, you know, multiple years of life. And I think this is something that is really shocking. It's I think it's a real disgrace that we live in a country that can sustain such disparities in such a basic thing. You know, how long a healthy life can you expect? And I think the pandemic should, you know, the pandemic, of course, has highlighted some of these health inequalities, but it's also, I think, it should also give us a little bit of pause for thought about what we think of the country's good at. We did go into the pandemic thinking the country had this great life sciences sector. So I think there was some complacency that, you know, the government said in February, nowhere is better than prepared for a pandemic. It didn't turn out that way. And what we've seen, you know, we have got areas, you know, the Oxford vaccine's a great triumph for life sciences. That's really powerful. But we've seen other areas, public health, diagnostics, the care sector, weaknesses in those sectors have been really brutally exposed. And I think this emphasises that I think we've really made a bit of a category error in thinking about the life sciences sector as a sector at all. We've got, you know, the bit that makes advanced pharmaceuticals is great, and it's very important economically, and it produces good outcomes. But there's a whole bunch of innovation about how you serve the health of the wider population where we've done much worse. And I think that's where we need more sense of the public priority. And of course, to get me back to levelling up, we've got this, there's our map of the health outcomes. If we look at where we spend money on health research, it's even more focused than the rest of it. Actually, 55% of healthcare related research in the UK goes to London, Cambridge and Oxford, which are, of course, you know, ironically, the healthiest places in the country. And I can't help but think that this must affect the priorities of that set our healthcare research. And so I think there's a really serious case that we need to think seriously about, you know, what actually is important in healthcare research. What are those priorities? What are people worried about? You know, what are how would the community groups prioritise the needs of healthcare in a way that could be different from this very, you know, if I can put it this way, it's a very elite science focused view of what needs to be done. Finally, the big issue is net zero. We had this massive task of getting the economy onto this basis of having net zero greenhouse gas. And we've done not too bad. The government's very proud of what we've done so far. In some ways, it's been the easy bit. We've exported our heavy industry, we've moved our power onto gas, and we have made big progress on low carbon electricity through a combination of biomass, offshore wind, and keeping our old nuclear power stations running for longer than their design life. But it's this next bit that's going to be a massive challenge. We've got to fully decarbonise and expand the electricity generation, think of storage, decarbonise industry, decarbonise transport, decarbonise housing. We've got to think about land use. It's really a complete rethink about the way that our society is organised, with ramifications. Part of this is about kind of high-tech science, about how you can develop better power generation techniques, but part of it's about land use. It's about how do you persuade communities that maybe that you'd want that growing trees is better than having upland sheep. There's about how people live their lives in terms of how much transport they use. So this is a massive challenge that I think has really got to involve everyone in a way that we're just starting to see now. So just to finish with, at the moment we've got a research system that's built on this idea of excellence. So what we need to do is think, how can we co-create place-responsive research programs that maintain excellence? And of course, every time I say excellence, I have to put a footnote in which says for some values of excellence. Excellence is a kind of enormously contested term that I think we really need to think deeply about what we mean, and that's particularly important when it comes to place. I think we need to integrate knowledge of what the local needs and perspectives are. We've got to think about the local endowments of places. We've got to think about the national and international context too. But I think this is going to need new institutions. And of course, the irony is, or the difficulty is, those places that need to have their local needs and perspectives integrated are precisely the places that, as Vidhya's original map showed, lack the social fabric or is disadvantaged when it comes to social fabric in building those institutions. So I think this, public engagement has an enormously important role in kind of setting priorities, but actually we need to step back and think, how do we build the institutions that can create place-based research systems that do respond to local needs? So I'll finish by saying I think universities and research communities really central in addressing these UK's regional imbalances. And I think the three big priorities: jobs and living standards, I think, remain a high priority, health and social care, and the sustainable economy. With that, I'll stop. Say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. I would like to pick up Dom's question immediately. And Dom's asking both of you, what advice would you give to universities in making sure that they're responding to a community need, rather than engagement becoming more of a colonial, paternal, Victorian philanthropist style of doing good, which the term civic can sometimes evoke? Vidhya, I wondered whether you had any thoughts about how to stop it becoming a kind of Victorian philanthropy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easy in principle, quite difficult in practice, but basically I think you don't assume you know the answers, go in and listen, so convene, set the boundaries, the limits of what you're able to do, but then go in and listen to what the community thinks the answers are, and act on their agenda, not bring your own agenda, and use your convening power to bring others to the table. So I'll give you a more concrete example. So we had been funding in the Liverpool City region for a few years. We'd made disproportionately more grants there than in other parts of the country. And we were really keen as a funder who's always been very focused on leveraging our investment to do more in the area, work with more of the strategic stakeholders, etc., to support community business. So we went into the city region thinking, right, we need to do more here, but through helpful guidance of various people that we were engaged with, our first step over probably about a year was to just convene the community businesses in the area and say, what is it that you need and what role can we play? We didn't even really ask the second question, what role can we play? It was really, what is it that you think this sector needs in this area? And we built the shared agenda then from those responses, rather than coming with a set of assumptions of our own as to what was needed. I think what we were then able to do was take that to the combined authority, to the local authorities. So we were then able to use our convening power as an institution to get the agenda further than if those community businesses had tried to do it by themselves. But it was very much us sort of propelling their agenda forward, rather than us bringing our own agenda, expecting them to join in with it and taking it forwards. So I think that's the critical thing. Go in without your own assumptions about what's needed, and listen and develop a shared agenda that's rooted in what you're hearing from local community organisations, local people.
And I would add, and I agree with that entirely. And I think, it's just that listen word is the important one. And actually, sometimes be prepared to hear some quite hard things spoken to you. I mean, those of us in kind of nice research universities in the better parts of the city do need to be prepared to listen to people say, what have you ever done for us? Because that's what they'll say. And you just take it seriously.
So Lorraine Coghill has asked, Vidhya, do you have any tips on how we can better embed community partnership working from within our institutions when we're often working alongside temporary funding, short-term contracts and the history of short-term projects? And Richard, I guess for you, that same question, that when you're looking at how do you reimagine, research institutions in new places, actually, how do we do that when funding is often not sustained long enough to enable that place-based work to happen? So Vidhya, I'll come to you first, if I may.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't kind of dismiss the challenges, and I'm probably not best placed to comment on, and Richard's probably better placed to comment on how you make the internal case, because I'm not an academic sitting in a higher education institution. But one thing I would say from the work that we've done is that there are also opportunities to build partnerships with funders that will enable work to be funded for you to engage more with communities. So if I think back to the Liverpool work that we did, so we funded as Power to Change that research that was done by the university, the HEls Institute, that was looking at the community business market, which was then pivotal to how that whole engagement has gone forward with the combined authority. So by working with communities, you can access different pots of funding that may be helpful in terms of, we would fund community-led research and community-rooted research, but we wouldn't fund other kinds of research. So our money, for example, is then available to universities, and we've spent 5% of our endowment on research. So we funded a lot in this community space. So look potentially to those. I mean, I think Dawn and Ottilie were talking about yesterday aligning social sector money with research. So I think there are ways in which greater partnerships between funders and universities can also help unlock and deal with some of those internal challenges of short-term contracts, short-term funding.
Great, thank you. And Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing here is that you need senior people in the university to understand that this is part of the kind of core infrastructure for the university, if you like. And you can support it on short-term money. Lots of key infrastructure in universities is supported by short-term money, but you have enough of it, and if you can convince people that it's an ongoing thing, then you can make it a core cost. I mean, I am very, one of the things I am proud of in the time that I was PVC at Sheffield was converting the catalyst, getting the catalyst money, getting the public engagement team set up, and then transferring it onto the core funding at the end of that. Then, the other side of the coin then is you need to work with your research offices to make sure that all the opportunities that you have for getting a bit of money here and a bit of money there added on to, major research funding can be, you can harvest that money and redirect it to support your core teams. So that's sorry, that will probably sound a very idealistic response, but that's how it ought to happen. And if there's willingness, and I think there is willingness in the research councils and UKRI to put in money to support this kind of activity. So it's making sure that inside the university you can join money coming in at one end with supporting key core teams at the other end. And that's, you do need senior mind for that. But as I say, I think the kind of messages that we're getting from UKRI should be helpful in persuading people that's going to happen. But I say that I'm just really conscious. I know lots of people are on short-term contracts, and it's really tough and not an ideal way of treating people who I think really are central to the mission of the university.
And I think being idealistic is actually quite important in this agenda of like reimagining new ways of doing research that actually brings benefit to a wider number of people. I did pick up from your talk, Vidhya, that you were talking about how many community businesses were focused on addressing social isolation. If I remember correctly, I think you said about 85%. And one of the things I think is interesting in this agenda of communities working alongside research institutions to co-create agendas for research is how much those two agendas will align. Is it possible for those agendas to align? So I wonder if you would reflect on that, to what extent you think that the things that the community want and are keen on could actually be matched with a research agenda that the research institution would be keen on. And Richard, from the research point of view, to what extent you think that those can correlate?
It's an interesting question, and it's obviously going to vary sort of markedly by department within universities, etc. I suppose I can just draw on our experience, which is, over 5 years, we've spent millions of pounds on building the evidence base for community business. It was a core feature of what we were trying to do, and part of the way we've supported the sector is to grow the evidence base and build a robustness around the evidence base that is supporting community business. I think there's a huge amount of work that could support communities that meets the standards of high quality, robust, research excellence. So I don't see that there is a real tension there. But I think for me, one of the things is maybe I'm going to say this it's not the conference to say this, but I think I worry slightly about the term public engagement, because it feels like this thing you add on to what the university does. I think more and more of this conversation is talking about, knitting together the priorities of communities and place with the priorities of the university. And that feels like something beyond what I think about when I hear public engagement. And for me, it's slightly reminiscent of the conversations we have with the corporate sector around CSR, which always feels like this slight add-on. And actually, increasingly, we're talking about putting purpose back into the heart of business. So for me, there's sort of an analogy there. And so I do think there's an incredibly strong research agenda that can meet both the needs of communities and the need for rigorous sort of research of the highest standard. But maybe it requires us to think slightly differently about what this agenda is really about.
Brilliant. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think that idea of public engagement being an add-on is something that many in our delegates will be nodding their heads and going, yeah, it's not an add-on, it's a different way of thinking about and conceiving of working around research. So that made me, I couldn't agree more. And so, Richard, did you have a reflection to add to those thoughts?
Yeah, I think another piece of jargon that we get used to in our business is this thing, it's knowledge exchange, isn't it? And so, and I think universities need to be outward-facing organisations that have partnerships with all kinds of outside organisations, from multinational companies to SMEs to community-based businesses to NGOs and the charity sector. And I think it's important. All of those things are different, and you need to think about what the constructive ways in which you can interact with any of those different kinds of organisations. And I think community organisations, social enterprises are a really important part of that. They're often a very good way of getting involved in communities. That there can be strong research elements to that, and there can also, and actually also it's another very important place where things like student volunteering can be really powerful. So at the risk of everything, there is this continuum, and lots of an outward-facing university needs to engage with many different kinds of organisations, and it does go back to that listening and being, rather than saying, here's what we can offer you, it's let's talk about what you do and to just find out something where we can work together.
I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things really as we move towards the end of the session, and there are lots of questions coming in I think one of the threads that's coming through is I guess, how can we as researchers and universities respond appropriately to this expectation? And I feel that there's a lot of expectation there'll be some kind of really quick wins and some magic solutions that are place-based outcomes, will be delivered really quickly. But it feels to me the logic of what you're saying, Vidhya, is that isn't going to happen. This is going to take a really long time to build the kind of relationships and the trusts that will allow excellent place-based outcomes to arise. And that's potentially going to take years. So how on earth can we make that argument back to government without appearing to be saying this is just too difficult and we really can't get anything to happen very quickly?
I mean, two reflections on that. One, you're not starting from scratch. I mean, this is, as Richard's demonstrated several times in what he said, I mean, this isn't a new agenda, and many universities have been doing good stuff and have partnerships already, and I described a few. So yeah, you're not starting from scratch. So I don't think but it does to do it well does take time. I think, pragmatically in terms of government, you do need to have those, you do need some quick wins, but you also need to, I think, then lay the ground for that longer term, deeper, more meaningful partnerships. And I think, judging by our experiences, there's real benefit to working with intermediaries like the role that we've played at times in certain places, who are trusted by the community, but also then can interface with you. So one of the questions was on the Q&A was around, much like business catapults, do you need sort of an intermediary to sit between lots and lots of small community organizations and quite large higher education institutions? And I think actually long term you probably don't, but it can be a way to make progress more quickly. It's you find trusted intermediaries that really have the trust of the community, because that's the primary the thing that's most important, and then work with them to start to unlock some of those relationships, to start to convene, to start to bring people together.
I think, I will reflect to start with that, we have been doing this for a long time. And, you introduced me as having been doing it since the Catalyst program. My baptism of fire was showing up in a community hall in Halifax in 2004 to talk about nanotechnology, if I remember rightly. So, we've been doing it a long time. I know, many people listening are kind of grizzled veterans at this who've done some really great stuff. I think we've got a lot of things to be proud of. Paul, you've been coordinating and keeping track of lots of things. So, in a sense, I would put the problem the other way around, in that, suddenly there's been this new political emphasis on place that's appeared in the last year or so. And here we are with a huge wealth of experience, stories to tell, case studies to give that are already there. So I think, in a sense, we're saying here's a community that's ready to do what you want and has actually learned a lot about it and has made some of the mistakes already and is ready to go. And I think the other side of it, I mean, you are right though. I mean, I think we have got very deep seated, these imbalances are very deep seated, and it's not something that can be turned around very quickly, but we're there and already starting on the job, and with quite a lot of experience to build on.
Thank you. Just picking up on the question from Kirsty, which was about this overwhelming focus on productivity, and of course, in the fallout from COVID-19 and from Brexit, I think that economic impact is just going to be enormous. But Kirsty asks, communities are clearly facing a range of challenges just beyond just the financial ones. How can we make sure the other challenges aren't ignored? I wondered, perhaps Vidhya, if I come to you, whether you had any reflections on that brilliant question from Kirsty.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a general move towards thinking more about sort of overall well-being rather than, straightforward productivity and economic growth. And I think to the better, because I think that reflects much more the human experience of growth, which is what communities sort of value, rather than the headline numbers. But I think fundamentally, I suppose what I took from Richard's slides was not that productivity was the only measure that was important, but that it is a pretty good measure of economic prosperity or potential for economic prosperity. And we know that is very starkly related to some of the other measures of well-being that we are interested in. So being worried about the economic potential of places, I think, is right and proper, because that does relate so much. The coastal communities have weak fabric in part because they have very transitory labour markets with poorly paid jobs. It's really hard to disentangle those two factors. So I think what's increasingly coming out for me in terms of the levelling up agenda is the importance of economic and social dimensions. But I think that's not to say that those economic dimensions are not important, but we do need to take a more rounded view to recognise that however good we make broadband and HS2, etc., we're not going to crack it. There is a social dimension to the levelling up agenda as well as an economic one.
Great, thank you. I'm going to come back to you both just in a second for any sort of final reflections on the conversation. Any kind of positive thought perhaps that we could all take away in terms of what to do next. And Richard, I did appreciate your call to arms almost about articulating the value of the work that we can already account for. That was great. So I'll come to you both in a second for that. I suppose just one thing that struck me, and reflecting on what's coming through in the chat, is how easy it is to try to simplify what is a really complicated situation. And I'm just picking up on Sarah Barnes's comment about London. And as somebody who worked in London as a teacher sort of 30 years ago, actually the levels of deprivation within London are enormous. And so it's so easy, isn't it, to kind of fall into a kind of oversimplifying what is so deeply entangled. And Sarah's point was, maybe we need to differentiate between boroughs in London in order to kind of try to make the case around the civic infrastructure and the sort of the inequalities and how they're experienced in different parts of the country. It's been great to rehearse these arguments with you. We are going to share the chat and the questions, and we're going to sort of put a write-up of this event so that people can see the threads and the themes that emerged. We'll make sure that the links that have been shared are open for you as well. But maybe if I come to you first, Vidhya, any sort of final reflections? Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Two things. One, just picking up on the point you just made. I mean, yes, there is definitely a neighbourhood dimension to this, not just a sort of local authority dimension. I think we ignore that at our peril. But just to conclude, I think I would say, one thing I think we've all taken away from COVID is community really matters. The strength of community matters, and it's part of the place resilience of any area. So the resilience of a place is partly about the strength of its community. I think you, as the higher education sector, have a really huge opportunity to help build that place resilience and help strengthen the community. The value you can add through research to enabling communities to make a much stronger, better evidence, more robust case for the things that matter to them and the ways in which they want to improve their places is huge. So I think it's, there really is a big opportunity for you to be a huge part of that levelling up kind of community strengthening agenda.
Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, I think, universities are very strong institutions, often, amongst the strongest institutions in some of these places, but they can't do it by themselves, and this all has to be done in partnership. And I would like to see, more partnership between universities. Greater Manchester has 5 universities in it. They all ought to be in this together, working together to support their community. And with other parts of the system, we should talk much more to FE colleges than we currently do. They have a very important role, very close to employers, very close to their communities in many cases. So I think it is about being. This is difficult because tough times do make institutions turn inwards a bit, but we do need to be very conscious in not doing that at this particular moment, and just getting together as right across our communities and working together with the other institutions on what I think is a crucial agenda.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to both of you. I'm sure if we were in a room together, the applause would be really, really significant. But you can take a virtual approval from just looking at the chat and looking at the feedback. And thank you so much to our delegates and the audience for being so responsive and so thoughtful.